Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, if you've watched the channel with any regularity, you'll probably have noticed me mention something called marine juice. Now, it was an old army painting technique from the Forge World team, and it was a universal armor wash, which they chucked over pretty much all of the marines that they were painting for the Horus Heresy. Now, it has been adapted, I've had a play around with it, and what happened was that Games Workshop changed the recipes of some of their shades, which meant it just wasn't working the same as it had been in the past. Now, I've played around with different alternatives, I even made another one, and then the army painter discontinued one of the ingredients I was using for that. So, what I have for you here today is a universal armor wash, or pretty much universal for anything, with ingredients that have either just been released or, fingers crossed, will not change. So we are going to be using today new Dark Tone from the Army Painter, new Reikland Fleshshade from Games Workshop, and Lamian Medium, which, man, I hope they don't change it. So the recipe for this will be in the description. Yeah, let's get started. This is nice and simple. So first off, we're going to mix this stuff up. Now you'll notice that the bottles in front of me are already empty because I already made a big batch of this stuff. All you're going to need is one bottle each of Dark Tone, Lamian Medium, and Reikland Fleshshade. Now, the interesting thing is of course, since they changed the formula on these, Games Workshop also made the bottles on their shades a little bit smaller. Sneaky, sneaky. All the same, what it does mean is that both the shades and the tones, the washes from Army Painter, they are both 18 milliliter bottles. The Lamian Medium, by contrast, no pun intended, is instead in a 24 milliliter bottle. So there's more of this than there is of the other two, obviously. This works out at a ratio of 3 parts to 3 parts to 4 parts, which is a lot of faff. If you want to do a smaller batch of this, maybe measure out droplets into a well or something, you can give it a shot beforehand. But I do recommend, if you want to keep it simple, you like the look of this, just get a bottle of each. There's no complicated mixing. Dump it into a container, mix it up, and then decant it into something. I have a pretty large collection of little empty bottles that I ordered from Amazon. Got 50 or so of those. It cost me a couple of euros, and they are perfect. These 3 decanted into 3 squeeze bottles, and easy as. So actually applying it is much the same as any other shade or wash. Just load up your brush, and the same sort of general tips apply. When you're applying it, don't just splodge it on and leave it. You want to work it into the recesses deliberately and move it down any flat areas. So you see his trousers here. I'm not just going to leave it like that. I'm going to move it up and down, focusing on down mostly. I want to take it towards his shoes. But this fella here is going to get the all-over shade treatment. Now, of course, straight over white like this, once it dries, it's going to look grubby, but there's a good reason for that. And with a bit of context later on, you'll see where I'm going with this. All the same, let's get a look at this once he is dry. So once that's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. And it is obviously a little bit more grubby than a pure white would be, but importantly, it's really smooth. And more than anything, I think that's what the extra medium is really going to be useful for if you mix this up. So what I'm going to do is pop this fella aside, and we're going to look at a couple of use cases and something else you can do with this too. Somebody did mention on Twitter that not having great eyesight, it actually quite helped them having a sort of a key wash so that they could see what they were doing with lightly primed miniatures and then be able to paint over the top. So that's one quite useful use of this. It's not going to muddy any of the colors that go over the top. So, step 1. But step 2, let's actually chuck it on something. So I've got one of my Death Guard here, and I have prepped it up in the same way that I have ordinarily. So, sprayed him black from underneath, primed from above with Wraithbone, couple of coats of the colors that I want on him, golden. Like, I've done this a few times on the channel by now, but how does the new marine juice stack up? So let's go ahead, bucket this all over him. I'm going to be quite generous because, most of my other guys are a little bit grubby looking. But as you see, putting it straight over the helmet like that, it flows beautifully, goes straight for the recesses, and it's not going to stain anything too much. So, over the entire miniature, what do we get? Now it occurs to me just as I'm applying this that the same trick applies on a Marine as it does on a Bavarian infantryman or anything. Nice sweeping motions, working down the miniature. As you see, I've worked in sections, so his arms and other legs are done. This is going to help prevent any areas where it dries as you're working, and then when you come back to add more, sort of wrecking the effect. But moving down the miniature as much as possible, keeping things nice and smooth. And once he's dried, ta-da! Now obviously I have cheated a little bit by chucking the base on him straight away, but I think it goes a long way to proving you don't need to do a huge amount to make a Marine look fine. This fella has had no highlighting, nothing extra done. That is literally just the Marine juice over those base coats. Now, like I mentioned, you've seen me do that on the channel before, but I will make sure there are links in the description to where you can watch me do this particular method, because, come on, you plonk an army down like that, it's going to look brilliant. Doesn't have to be highlighted, doesn't have to be perfect. Simple painting, simple base, job's a good one. But what if you're not painting Marines? Well, my historically minded chums, what I have here is one of the Bavarian line infantry from Piano Wargames. Now this fella here is a 3D print, but you can also get them in white metal. And if you are planning on looking at Napoleonics in metal or printing, go check out Piano Wargames. This isn't sponsored, they're just stunning miniatures. So, I have painted him up with his yellow facings, yellow collar, and gold buttons. He is from the Herzog Pius Regiment, and he needs a shade, you know. So, I've got my Marine juice, or sledge sauce. I haven't settled on what we're going to call this yet. But let's mix it up, and over we go. Now, obviously, straight over the white, you can tell what that's going to do, and remembering to keep it moving. But the reason why this is going to work over the entire miniature is that tiny little hint of red that's lurking in this shade is actually going to work quite well over the blue as well, because what happens is it gives it a faint purplish shade in those recesses. So making sure I get all of the creases, keep things nice and smooth there. Over the entire miniature, let's see what this chappie looks like once he is dried. And once again, what we're left with is somebody that, as part of a regiment, we could certainly plonk on the table looking quite nice. What I am going to do, though, is a couple of very quick highlights. I'm going to paint a couple of highlights on his trousers using ivory rather than a pure white, but his crossbelts I will highlight with a white. Do a little bit on his skin and a little bit on his jacket. Let's see what touching up this Marine juice will give us. And there we have it. Everything that you're seeing is just one highlight, except for his face, where I did add a second over the top because I like painting faces. But the value of the juice or the sludge or whatever we're going to call it here is that without going so dark with it, what we can do is go straight to the highlighting instead of having to bring out a mid-tone or go back over with the base coats again in order to bring those out. So even from behind, I haven't done anything to his pack, but those little bits of extra detail in his cross belts and just a handful of white highlights on his trousers, he looks quite smart. I'll put him in the front rank. Now finally, what I've got here is what we prepared earlier. This fella, he was primed white in the same way as the Bavarian at the very beginning, and I've then given him the all-over shade treatment. Now what we're going to use this for is as a pre-shade for contrast. If you've seen the slap-chopped technique mentioned, you might get an idea of where this is going. But what I'm going to do is introduce a little bit more volume to the miniature by lightly dry brushing him here with some matte white. I want to leave a fair chunk of this, particularly for the armor, because honestly, by the time I've dry brushed the armor white, it'll be done. But the other details, I want to give the contrast something to key onto. So, making sure I'm not applying too much white. Let's dry brush this whole fella, lighten him up a little bit. So now what we have is a situation where the recesses on the miniature are much deeper and darker, where our high points are white or close to it. So we're basically going to really push what the contrast effect normally does. So I'm going to paint them up. I'm going to use a mix of contrast, speed paint, express, all that sort of thing, because it doesn't matter too much. I have done Cult of the Rusted Claw on the channel before, so if you want to see one way that you could do that, again, I'll try and make sure to remember to pop the link in the description. But once I'm finished with this, let's get a look at what a bit of contrast looks like over our pre-shade. And so, third time's the charm, this fella is done too. Now I have taken him outside and I've varnished him, and over the top of the speed paint metallic, I did add a dark tone wash, just to darken that down a little bit and add a bit more definition there. Again, nothing spectacular, but the finish on this is pretty cool, and I figure if you put a whole army of these guys down, same as with the others so far, it's going to look great. So, let's get a look at all of them together. And there at last, our examples are complete. So there's lots of reasons to give this a shot. Whether you're going to use it as, well, it was originally intended as a once-over marine washing miracle, yeah, go for it. Works for pretty much everything. Though, of course, there are still some cases where you're going to want a different shade. Iron Hands, Raven Guard, very dark miniatures, you're probably not going to get the most out of this. But hopefully over the top of that nice blue jacket on the Bavarian chap coming around now, you'll see that that little bit of purplish hint you get in some of the darker colors, like blue or green, will still help you out quite a bit. So I do recommend mix it up, have a play around with it, see what you like the look of. It is a nearly universal wash, and I use it for pretty much everything. Finally having a hopefully future-proofed wash version. I'm looking forward to this lasting for the next 5 years or so, unless, of course, Games Workshop decides to change the recipe of something else again, but we'll wait and see for that. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and most importantly this time, shades, including my wonderful producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. You really make the difference. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.